All right. Welcome to another Data Hurdles. I'm Chris Detzel, and
I'm Michael Burke. How are you, Chris?
pretty good, man. It's summertime, and we're going to be off for a week here at Reltio. We're excited. I know you are too, Michael. Huh?
I am. I'm really excited. And a big shout out. We got the 4th of July coming up, Independence Day, to all our veterans. If we got any listening. I know we have one on the call with us, speaking of which. So today we
Woo.
have a special guest, Matthew Cox. Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Matthew Cox. I've had a chance to be in this amazing industry of data for many years now, and I've had a chance to spend time in really several different sectors of the industry, from data use to data mastering to data capture to data leverage. So one of the things I think I've enjoyed in my career is this 360 relationship with data. But on top of that, yes, Army veterans, very excited to see the 4th of July come forward and see a few sparkles in the nighttime sky.
Yeah, that's excellent. We've got a big fireworks show planned. I go up to my friend's house every day, also a veteran every 4th. And we put on this massive thousands of dollars in fireworks and we light it off right in front of the beach. Everybody comes and watches. It's a treat. So,
I'll be doing that at the ranch this next week.
oh, that's excellent.
Number four is not too many restrictions out on the ranch when it comes to celebrating the 4th of July.
Just don't catch
Exactly.
anything on fire.
It's, and yeah, so
It's real.
because it's my property, right? So
Yeah,
I,
exactly.
so I'm my own fire warden. So I watch how this thing plays out. But so I got to balance the fun and the security and safety. But yeah, we have a nice cement plateau that we launch everything from. So we try and be safe, but have a little holler too at the same time.
That's why he's going up to bale all that hay before the
I
4th.
kind of trim it up a bit. Yeah, I was getting way too long.
Anyways, today we're talking about, I would love to continue talking about the 4th, but I think for our listeners, today we're talking about data quality. And really, Matt, your expertise in this area is so broad and so diverse. But today, what we'd really like to dive into, and maybe we can start off with just explaining to our listeners, what is data quality and what does it mean really in your business context?
Sure. So let's talk about that for just a second because I think it's interesting the vantage point or the lens in which you look at data quality. I think from a business, let's just talk about maybe from a practical business standpoint. Yeah. And maybe what may be motivating business leaders or different functional leaders to want to engage or understand data quality. And I think first and foremost, it's as a functional leader, right? One of the first questions I'm going to have is the data that I'm working with capable of sufficiently fulfilling the business process or the business objectives that I'm trying to complete. For instance, if I'm in marketing, is the email address sufficient for me? If I'm in fulfillment, I probably need a high quality address. And so I think in a lot of times there's very much a parochial lens or a myopic lens applied from a business standpoint, because from a business side, you're not looking at the totality of data. You're not looking at the totality of the system to work with. You're really looking at what am I trying to do? And is the data I'm leveraging capable or is it sufficient quality for me to fill my business objective? And so I think you've got to lean into understanding and relating to those different business lenses to understand really what does data quality mean from a business context. And I think it's on top of that, it's important that people begin to step back from it and realize that, well, most people might assume data quality means, the information placed into a field. So think of city or state, you're on a form, but you're filling out some information. And do I validate city or state? Do I just allow it to be a free open field? But really, from a business standpoint, quality isn't limited to the fields to the data or the information entered in those fields. It really extends into how data is organized and how it's interpreted. Yes. So I can't have a record of information that has the best, highest quality data associated with it. But from my business standpoint, maybe the way that data has been organized. So think of a hierarchy. If that hierarchy is not correct, to me, it's still poor quality data. If I'm trying to run an analytic, if I'm trying to get a report on a piece of data, again, the data record may have the right attributes, but maybe the way in which it was processed, maybe the way in which the algorithm, the report was determined, that analytic, if it doesn't fulfill my business need or fulfill my business process, it's again, poor quality data. Maybe that data was great 3 years ago when we captured it, but now it's out of date. So freshness becomes an issue of data quality for me. Yeah, it was great. We entered it. We had great rules, but we haven't updated it in 3 years. So when I try and actually work on it, From a business standpoint, that data is poor quality. So I think it's when you look at the variety of ways in which data quality can be viewed, it highlights why it's very important to survey and collaborate across the organization before setting a particular course of action on data quality. And I specifically have seen this. I've known many very knowledgeable individuals, very well versed in data quality, who have embarked on intended data quality campaigns, yet failed to gain traction because they thought very purely of it's, I have very specific data quality measures from an IT or from a data standpoint, but they didn't take time to understand the actual core problems that the business was trying to solve and how it would be relevant to the lens in the way they were trying to operate from a business context.
No, that's absolutely great. I love that. I think that I had this similar challenge recently. I was trying to explain to a relative who's not technically versed what data quality was, right? And we started walking into it's really like a sailing a ship in the 1800s, right? If you take computers and technology out of it, what did you have? You had a compass, maybe a map, maybe you had somebody in the crow's nest, like keeping watch for things.
Looking for the
Every,
North Star.
everybody had to communicate and document and capture information effectively across the ship to steer it in the right direction, right? To get to land or wherever you're headed. And I think the same thing really holds true to data quality today. And I love how you emphasize that it is so important to start with the right questions. If you start with the wrong questions or the wrong objectives, wrong KPIs, you're going to be collecting data that's moving you in the wrong direction.
And on top of that, Michael, I think the other piece is that depending upon your approach, right? If you think about your approach when you go to the business and you're trying to establish data quality as a meaningful activity for them to, because first of all, you're going to ask them to engage their time. You're going to ask them to be involved, right? You're going to ask for their input, right? So again, from a business standpoint, I have an objective and you're taking me away from my objective to spend time on this. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it becomes, okay, but what do your new rules for data quality mean in
Yeah.
stumbling or inhibiting or becoming a barrier to my business process, right? Are you going to create this onerous set of requirements that now I can't even fulfill my SLA in delivering product to a customer? I remember from days when I was in marketing operations where, the exchange of information from a marketing standpoint was very key to the next steps and be able to
Yeah.
engage someone directly. If I came to you, Mike, you come to my website, all you want is a download. And I'm asking for 40 pieces of information because it's a great data quality capture moment, right? You're going to walk away. So I'm not going to, that's not worth me filling all that in front. So the whole concept of progressive profiling came about. Well, let's start with one. Let's just get your email. All right. Now, oh, hey, you want to get a piece of information? Let's grab some more information. So that the idea of this handshake or this relationship in which data quality gets infused into the business process at the time that it makes sense in the business process, that doesn't become a barrier to the fulfillment of the process, but simply enriches or enables or extends, is really what the goal should be, not some onerous list of very stalwart activities that says, listen, at the end of the day, my data quality has to trump everything else. It has to be partnership. It has to be the token, like a baton that we share together to meet that final race and declaring quality as part of the business process.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. How do you it makes sense for you and I or in enterprises that have a lot of experience in this or resources to get up and running pretty quickly. Actually, most of them probably have lots of data quality embedded in all of their systems. But as a small business, how do you get started? Maybe you are on a marketing team, or maybe you're on a siloed place that might not have data resources or stewards or experts. How do you start defining and moving forward into this quality vision of answering these types of questions?
I think first and foremost, when you begin the journey of data quality, I would highlight the word journey, right? Because I think the reality is that it is, and I've said this in other forms, you never really reach the end of data quality. You never really reach a finish line, right? It's a constant journey and it does require a bit of calm and a bit of patience in the approach to be successful. And so I think with any endeavor, right, that goes into data quality, you have to think above the tactics, right? A lot of times they'll think, oh, well, I've got to improve this piece of information, or I've got to find some tool that I can validate my data. I would always lift up the conversation or, take it to a higher level of an umbrella conversation around more of a strategy. What kind of data quality strategy are you looking for? And how does that align to the business goals that you're trying to fulfill. Because the two should work hand in hand. But I do think it part of data quality does expect that a structure of some kind is applied. And when you walk into this, you can't just, in my experience has been, you have to have a very structural approach with some sort of framework in order to organize your data quality efforts that really focus on data strategy or data scenarios that are most applicable to your business priorities. And that's regardless of the size of your organization. Whether you're a 100-person organization or you're 100,000, the reality is that not all data is the same, right? There are things that are, we'll call enterprise worthy, or they'll call, top priority data entities or data areas to focus. And you really have to be keen on what that number is. It's like the gold standard within your organization. What is actually moving our organization forward? And that's really what you want to target first. Because if you focus in the wrong areas, you could spend an awful lot of time and really fail to see meaningful results. Maybe it was a good effort. Maybe you did actually, have a nice effect, but did you actually move the needle of the organization from a data quality standpoint? And so I think you really have to look at what are the business expectations you have? What are the things you're actually trying to fulfill, and how can data quality improve it? What's the strategy you have around trying to engage that? What sort of structure can you put? So you have an organized framework in which you go against it, focusing on really those top tier enterprise worthy entities or enterprise worthy data you want to go capture and improve. And after that, you have the structure. You have to think about collaboration. I'll say this over and over again. That a data quality strategy is not an IT endeavor. It's not a business endeavor. It's not an operations endeavor. It really requires everyone to come together, because data is the lifeline of every organization. And so it touches every part of the organization, and you have to really collaborate, because if you only go and focus on a silo, if you only hit one small part of the org, you may have a small, nice effect, but your impact to the overall organization and your impact to the business goal is going to be diminished, because you're only hitting silos and not the entire end-to-end life cycle. So that collaboration is very important. I think, and especially as a new organization, you're trying to enable data quality, you've got to think about an incremental value-based approach, step by step, gain quick wins, demonstrate how a focus on data quality can actually have tangible results. And so you're not waiting for something to come forward, right? Take these small incremental steps, but make sure they're aligned to a structured strategy where you see that end-to-end approach actually be fulfilled. And personally, I've highlighted over and over again that because of the domain expertise that typically is required for data quality, whether it's mastering data, whether it's governing data, you really should partner with a knowledgeable external organization. That can be whether it's a solution integrator or whether it's a third-party data provider. The data quality is not a new thing to solve, but it is just a domain that needs understanding. And you can partner with a lot of organizations that can leapfrog you forward in that typical learning curve, so they can help you bypass those minefields and really focus on what's most important for the organization and give you a good place to start.
No, that's great advice. And I think that leapfrogging is something that all of us, especially those that come from a more technical background, want to never approach. We always want to build first and buy later. And I think it's such an important reminder that you can move faster with these experts that have done this 100 times before. Detzel, you've had some great examples. And if folks on the call haven't heard this before, listen to his community podcast on data, starting small, simplifying, getting to value quickly. I've been in a couple of your reports. It's just so clear, crisp, concise, and it's easy to understand.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think that bringing that data to the business and the right stakeholders is the key. And, what I've tried to do, and you can listen to podcasts later, is bring my online community data, in addition to some of the programs I'm bringing, to automate it to a dashboard and to be able to tell that story. And the quality of that data is very difficult, by the way, to continue to get. So right now, I think it's at 90% of a data quality standpoint. How do I get to that next 10%? It's really difficult. And I'm like, because bringing all these systems together, just from what I'm doing, this small, for me, big, but the project that I'm doing, it's not easy getting over to that 10%. 90%, not that it's easy. It's difficult, but it's a lot easier to do that than it is to think about that other 10%.
I think you're just made a really good point, Chris. And let me just take a moment to talk about that.
Yeah.
90%, by the way, is very good. If you're getting 90% data quality, you're doing very well. And I think too often the search for perfection gets in the way of making meaningful incremental steps and celebrating those steps. It's very hard to get 100% on any part of your data landscape because of all that's involved, especially when you have multiple hops, you've got multiple systems in line.
Yep.
We should always strive for perfection, but if that's our only measure, there's going to be a lot of frustrated people in the room every time.
Completely agree.
So I think it's really important that you strive for it. That it's like a stretch goal, right? A stretch goal of your project or program. You have a stretch goal for what you want to arrive at, but then celebrate each moment as you begin to get closer with the realization. And I think, Chris, you bring that a very good point, with the realization that very last part is very hard to overcome, right? That last 5-10% will equate to probably the entire amount of time you spent getting to that point. Because when you're really trying to hone in and refine it, it reminds me, Michael, of like high availability, right? You go from 99% is one, but 99.9999, from going from just 99 to 99.999 is a huge investment. It's a huge move from a high availability standpoint. And I think the same things from data. At some point, you may even question, and I think it's a reasonable question, is it worth us getting better than 90? Is it worth is it worth the money? Is it worth the business effect? Maybe that last 10% of expecting perfection on every form is too much. Maybe that then becomes a barrier to the business process. So, Chris, those are very important, parameters to be considering. People enter into the data game, that it is something perfection at the very hard measure to apply, and it'll probably end up being something that frustrates you and your preference within the business.
It's sometimes tough though, but because the questions that are asked is, oh, there's only X number of people coming to this thing. And I'm like, ish. Like, it's actually probably a little more, but I just couldn't figure out how to get that in there. Like
into our world, Chris. This is the world we live in. The ish.
Yeah. I'm like, all right, this is gonna have to be good enough. And if I have to tell a story around, look, the best I could do is this, but it is really good. And here's pretty much the data that is needed. So anyways,
But I'm going to take one more tangent from your comment. So I'm going to talk about a topic I've heard a lot in my career and I've tried to challenge, and that's this aspect of data being directionally correct, right? There's this feeling that I just gather enough data, I've got enough data that it's going to be directionally correct when I apply it. And I really had to challenge that, because if you can take that massive data, but if you don't apply good data quality parameters, good validation parameters to it, it could just as easily be directionally incorrect. And I've seen in many cases where predictive analytics or other techniques are applied where they're celebrating, oh, look what we found out. But then we start to dig in a little bit, you realize that the data, for whatever reason, skewed the business decision away. And there's this mass surprise. We thought it'd be directionally correct because we threw so much data. The volume of data is an indicator of nothing other than you collected a lot of data, right?
Yeah.
You really want to derive valuable business information, decision support, analysis. You have to apply some good principles if you want to make sure the decisions that are coming from that data set are moving you correctly in the direction you should proceed.
I couldn't agree more. And look, in the machine learning data science space, it's even more confusing, right? Because you've got multiple things driving you in different directions necessarily. I highly recommend for our people on the call, if they haven't read it before, to check out a book by Clay Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma or Solution. Really, 90% of what you need to do is come up with the right questions to ask to get at the problem, to structure it so you know what data to collect. And if you don't have that all set up and you have experiments that are going to articulate why and how you're traveling in the right direction, even if you have correct data, you could be doing the completely wrong thing. And so often that happens in the real world.
Yeah. And to that point, from an ML's perspective, even if what you did today was correct, if you assume that's going to be consistently correct all the time, you're making another mistake. Maybe we talk about a lot. It will naturally begin to drift. Data quality will naturally begin to drift. The effect, the decision support will naturally begin to drift if you don't compensate for that over time. You have to measure over time to make sure you're still in alignment. And that, and it's interesting because I've seen in a number of cases, so let's talk about data migration for just a second. I've seen a number of cases where
Hmm.
The role of data migration is not fully understood. So you have an old data set, you want to move it to a new platform. Typically, what I've seen, and it's terrible practice, but typically because of project timelines or project priorities, we just lift and shift. We grab
Yep.
that data and we port it over, and nothing is done to, in that transformational moment, to correct it, to move to the new platform. And you end up basically creating the same problems and the same behaviors that you had in the previous system. And I think that there's two pieces of that that's very important. One, you should absolutely, during any sort of data migration, apply whatever active data quality principles you have in place, right? Whether it's data validation, it's structural cleansing, it's completeness, name your measure. That is an opportune time to really lift up the value of that data prior to a migration. But secondly, I think what a lot of people make a mistake of as well is they only measure data quality at that point of migration.
Yep.
What happens a year later? What happens 2 years later? We just talked about from a data quality standpoint, I think one of the great dark secrets when data quality is stale data. Most people will not talk about staleness, right? As being one of the first things they think about when it comes to data quality. And I think if we have to put that first and foremost, that freshness is as important indicator as accuracy and completeness and everything else, because stale data in my mind is poor data.
Absolutely. And it's so funny when, you see this time and time again that as soon as, if you're collecting data for something, so many parameters can affect that change over time. And I look at this thing that always used to come back to, it was an epiphany to me, was I couldn't figure out why when I first started out in the product space, people were always releasing their projects in June, right? Why not at the end of the year? Why not at the beginning? And what I had found out was that everybody was releasing their products in June because that was when we had this huge spike in sales and activation. And so everybody was celebrating these great triumphs of look at how much we've increased everything. They'd celebrate, move on. And it was essentially gamifying the quality of the data.
Yes.
And I think that's another really critical point to call out is that as soon as people become aware of some sort of trend or pattern in data, they start to abuse that more often than not. So not only is it about maintaining the quality of the data, but the awareness of the people interacting with creating that quality, it
Yes.
can have a huge impact.
And
Uh,
and it's interesting because probably so often people will talk about the platforms, right? I'm mastering data, I'm validating data, and they have this perspective that almost like a washing machine, right? No matter what you put in, I can cleanse and I can fix. And
yeah,
I always go back to the first and foremost tenet of data quality is the data create process. It's at that very first point. I mean, we joke about garbage in, garbage out. You hear that a lot of times just being tossed around, but that is the reality of the state of a
yeah,
lot of organizations that they're underperforming their data quality check at the very initial point of engagement, and then expecting these backend systems to clean and process and Clorox and bleach all this data to somehow fix it. When the reality is we could fix the majority of our data quality problems if we just capture data accurately at the very onset of the data entry. But it is really a big to a lot of organizations. That's a barrier to engage. And I think it's really an important educational point within any organization to begin to prescribe why it is so important to capture at the very front and not wait for some backend system to somehow massage the data into an accurate state.
Just quickly, because I'll give you a live story of how I thought about this. And when I first started the Reltio community, but also the Imperva community back in the day, I knew that over time I would be connecting to other business systems. But what I didn't realize or understand was the data so let's say a customer comes to our online community, they log into the community. There's some areas that they have to select. They're either a customer, partner, or not, or, there's a lot of different things in there. And so one thing that I didn't notice that I did was they could select multiple things, which I didn't know. I thought it was just one thing, right? And so now whenever I come back to that, now they can't do that. But I didn't know that. And so I push all this data into to automate it. And they're like, we don't know if it's a customer or a partner or whatever, Now I got to go clean up that data myself but some of the things I just don't know, right? Or I didn't have somebody telling me, so I think it's important for organizations to say like maybe a data governance team or a data, I don't know, whatever teams that there are to help guide some of these things for new things that come out to bring in customer type stuff. So if you're talking to a marketing organization and they're getting, let's say, Marketo as a new platform or some other thing, it's like sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. They just think, I need to get this up and going, and I'm doing all these cool things. And then all of a sudden, now I'm going to have to go deal with 2 years later all these data problems that I didn't know I was going to have. So,
Now you're hitting on a great point to ask, right? I think Mike, you hit on
yeah.
this earlier. It's
Yeah.
the first things you should ask about data capture is what are you wanting out of it? What
Mhm.
are you expecting out of this information about capture? I think too often people assume, I know there's just pieces of information I feel that the people should enter, they should gather.
Mhm.
And they're not really thinking about, okay, how do I want to report? What are the exact reports? What are the analytics I want to run from that? What am I trying to discern from that data? How am I going to ultimately react or respond to the person who's entering the data? There's a lot of questions in that kind of 360 view of that data create point that
Yeah.
typically we don't ask. It's more
Yeah.
of, I have a form. I know I need to capture what event
Yeah.
they're going to, their email, their address, a couple more things, click submit, and we're done. And it's invariably 3 months, 6 months later, people start asking questions like, I can't get the reports I want. I don't understand what they're trying to say. I didn't align this and I didn't align that. So it's almost like when you're creating a presentation, when you create a slide, well, the first things you should be asking is, what are people going to derive or discern from this slide? When I'm
Yeah.
presenting this, what do I want them to get? What, from an audience perspective, what kind of response am I wanting? And we need to take the same seriousness when it comes to data capture on, let me
Yeah.
understand the full context of it before I throw it out there, because invariably I'm going to make a mistake. If I don't, then I'll have to have a whole cleanup process, or maybe I'll be migrating between platforms at some point. And I haven't thought through those pieces of puzzle.
It is incredible. And thinking about those trade-offs too, we had a simple login in one of the products I worked on, username and password. We were getting a ton of fraudulent logins because of that, people trying to log in. And so we added a CAPTCHA.
Yeah.
Real usage by adding a CAPTCHA dropped 30%. People stopped logging in.
Mhm.
And you're like,
Yeah.
we're doing this to protect you. We're doing it to clean our data, but we can't add it because it's having that much of a negative impact on customers. And so this is where
Hmm.
I think the complexities in the art of capturing data comes in. And how do you enable these kind of ways that are seamless and painless for our customers to enter data faster and more efficiently? And there's so many trade-offs like that that I think when people just create a form, they don't think about, or they just create some other way to capture input data. And the human element into that is more important than any machine learning and data quality. And I think if you can solve that problem up front, you're already ahead of the game. You can solve that capturing problem up front and make that invisible, ideally.
But I
You've
think
moved ahead.
goes back to that point we just made about a company entering into the conversation of data quality. Think about just the complexity we've spoken about in the last 10 minutes about just the data entry point, just the
Yeah.
very first step of how we engage
All
data.
right.
And
Yeah.
this is why I want to highlight the need for that data quality strategy. And it doesn't have to involve the ocean, doesn't have to be a thought of every, I that needs to be dotted and T that needs to be crossed. But it does say, how do I look at the broader view of how this data is going to be used and where it matters to me? And then tactically, I can start to address the data capture, the data processing, the data transfer, the data mastering. You begin to, at least this goes back to that structured view. I can have a structure, right, of what I want to see performed across that end to end. And I can attack it one step at a time. So I can have that quick value oriented or value frame moment where I say, hey, look at me. I just enabled and just addressed data capture. Great. Now let's move to the next step. Let's move to the next step. Then if you don't look at it from a strategy standpoint, you may declare success, right? In that data capture. Woo, look at us. We just nailed the data capture. Look at our number. But then fulfillment's coming back to you saying, guys, the data is garbage. What are you sending to me? Because you
Yep.
didn't think about the end. So I fear sometimes that one of the reasons data quality stumbles so much is because of people see the complexity and they're
Yeah.
white and they want to walk away. And the goal of data quality is to take a structured, systematic approach under some level of strategy in which you begin to see valuable steps being made. If you take that approach, you're going to have you're going to be successful much more often than you're going to fail in your attempt to deliver some sort of data quality improvement to the enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you think data is evolving so rapidly right now? I think faster than it has in decades, with this uprising of machine learning and more unsupervised ML models and complexities being layered on top of data to leverage it for certain use cases. How is that affecting data quality?
I think it's interesting to me because I think in a lot of cases, historically, data quality it became a human curation activity. There was a data steward, there was an individual that was spot checking or responsible for checking or validating information as it would flow through. It's becoming very clear to me that the pace of data changes, the volume of data that's coming through, the volume of sources that are coming in. And certainly, as you look at out large language models, just the volume of data means we really can't intervene from a human perspective. We're having less
Yeah.
and less of a chance to guide where the data is going. So I think that from my perspective, AI has a potential to engage in some of these data stewarding capabilities, right? Replacing some of that human curation. Number two, I think for me, sampling is becoming more and more important. I can't touch the totality of data. That's just
Yeah.
impossible. I think that we're going to be able to address it. Also, being very prescriptive, very intelligent about what sample of data is going to give me the broadest context to the overall model that I can feel like I'm able to rationalize where I stand from a data quality standpoint. And there's terms like we've used a term called ground truth. And the ground truth of being able to say, here's a data set, a microcosm of the larger data set that we feel represents ground truths. And let's now use that as our parameter to represent the broader set of data that we're processing against. Because the reality is it's not that it's becoming unmanageable, but it's unable for us to manage in a manual way or a human
Yeah.
intervention way. And we have to think about how we can leverage modeling, sampling, AI, and ML models that help us look at corrective behavior. We talked about drift earlier, right? There are some boundary conditions we can begin to put in place that help guide us on where the data set is moving one way or the other. And we have to very intelligently apply them. So we think at any level, we're going to be able to manage this at scale.
It is such an interesting point, and I think especially with LLMs and when you think about these massive feature sets and training sets that are being built out and collected, quality now has become something that is incomprehensible for an individual or even a team of individuals to truly represent.
Yes.
So again, we talk about stepping into the gray, Chris, right? Imagine these spaces where you're training these models off the internet.
Yeah.
How do you know that there's not bias, right? How do you know that the guardrails haven't been defined in the right direction? I do believe this is the way of the future, and I think that we're going to get better at this over time. But right now, I just feel like it's the Wild West a little bit again, right? Where we are trying to figure this out as we go.
But here's the crux of the problem, though, Michael, is that while it's becoming more and more Wild West, we're getting more and more compliance regulations being applied
That's
to the
true.
data under management, right?
Yeah.
So really at a point of jeopardy with a lot of the work that we're doing from this standpoint, because you can't lose control of your data quality to the point now where compliance and risk becomes too much of a problem for you to manage this because the fines, right, now being placed on these
Huge.
regulations are significant to revenue. There was a time, initially with several regulations where it was a $2,000 fine. It was a little slap on the wrist and, maybe there was some reputational risk, but there really wasn't a financial risk to the level it is today. So the real quandary for me is not just managing at scale from a data quality standpoint, but how do we manage to a scale that gives us confidence that we are complying with all of the regulations and risk controls that we're trying to put in place? That I think is one of the great challenges before us right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And for companies who are looking to apply these technologies, and really even anything in the AI space, there's this balance that I'd love your input on how do companies balance that need for using the latest technology versus in moving fast versus staying compliant and following regulatory. And of course, obviously, following regulation is important, but even just from an ethics perspective, using that capability to have control and understanding of what you're doing.
Yeah, I think it starts and stops for me. This is when we start talking about the governance conversation, right? For me,
Yeah.
or start with governance, and that really comes to taking a moment to stand back and ask the questions about the policies, the procedures, the standards, the rules, and having a cross-sectional or cross-functional group that can provide that input. I think if you lean too far on from an engineering standpoint or from an IT standpoint or from a business standpoint, you'll get a skewed perspective on really where should we stand and how far we should go. And so I think if you bring in individuals that have a risk or a compliance or a legal perspective, it helps provide some reasonable guardrails into the feedback and the forum on how do we execute, how far do we go? Because there is always this desire. I mean, look at the competitive landscape, right? With all the different AI tools coming out, it feels like we're in this race, right? It's like we're back, the early cars, you could build fast, solar.
Well, yep.
We're running, but it has to be a measured approach and taking all of those views into mind. How fast we want to move from a business standpoint? How quickly can we enable from an engineering standpoint? How much risk or compliance are we willing to take as we make that transition forward? It's really, in my mind right now, a meeting of the minds, and we're placing that to the governance structure so that you can make sure that the voices are all heard with each step, or you're bound to make a mistake.
Really interesting feedback. Yeah. I think that, as users continue to accelerate, not only in the AI space, but also across industries, we have to move faster, right? And this idea of real-time data has been prevalent in large organizations for a while now, but I think it's hitting every other business, even small businesses. You're starting to see these real-time interactions. How is quality playing an impact on real-time data? And how do folks deal with real-time data in production environments?
But this is very similar to me. If you supplant the conversation earlier about the business lens and you put it into the systems lens, typically what you found is the relegation of data quality into this back end process, right? Gather all your data, then do some sort of nightly or weekly or monthly review of data and see where the quality breakdowns are. And then we have this question of, okay, now which source do I go change it? I need to rectify this, go to this, your CRM or your ERP. And while we still, most companies still operate in that realm or in that range, I do believe we have to make the change. And this is where we start talking about data quality as a service. And so I think the aspect of data quality as a service is a very interesting one, but it's one that also has to be well balanced because like any other, just like the business process being fulfilled, a systematic process, whether it's an API or whatever technique you're putting in place, time is of essence, right? Processing time is of essence. So how broad do you make that data quality check when it's a service oriented activity? And I think that's part of where I'm seeing things begin to move is really looking at each of those, independent points of transaction and asking the question, what cleansing is necessary? Back to that point of before of what is sufficient for me to finish my business process? And the same approach has to be when you think about data quality as a service. What's sufficient for me to complete my transaction? Do I need to run 20 different checks on this record as goes through? No, let's validate the address. Let's validate this. Done. Let's validate the email address. Let's make sure that the phone number is structured correct. Where it goes to our telemarketing services. So I think data quality service has to be fluid. It has to be configurable. And it has to be lightweight in order for it to run as part of the transaction, which I believe that's what we're going to. The days of us spending 24 hours grinding through data, finding where there's some mismatches or data part problems, and then making a manual steward update in the source system, those days are over. Those days we're going to be exiting that phase of data quality. But we have to be really smart. I love the idea of microservices. So the idea of a data quality service, supported by a series of microservices that can be independently engaged based on what's necessary to fulfill that particular sequence of events. This is the direction I believe is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also this idea of observability as part of quality, right? There are now hundreds, maybe even thousands of touch points where data can have these microtransactions in them. Who's looking at that bird's eye view? Who's seaming that together and making sure that all of these things could be owned by different people who are making changes at different times? And there are impacts across the entire ecosystem. So that web that we've spun now needs to be detangled and really organized in a way that you can see from beginning to end on any of your critical services, who's touching what and when.
I think that and that goes back to that point today of the idea that you have one central organization that's responsible for all things is all beginning to break. I think the idea now is you've got to begin to federate out the responsibilities, but that also means focusing, less maybe on the technology side and more on the standards that you're being applied, more on the principles that you're applying that you're delivering. because you don't have one group now who's responsible for all the technical delivery of data quality. You have to enable and import and entitle the various groups to be able to perform those capabilities. It just begins to expand to your point of all the different transactions. One group can't possibly manage, certainly in an
Yeah.
enterprise organization, all of the different micro transactions going on. But at least if we enable them with a standards approach, with a governance board that allows them to drive rules and regulations policies with the principles and patterns that they should follow, then we're doing the best we can to enable each group to work independently, but align in a cohesive way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, guys, this was awesome. We talked a lot about just the current state of what data quality is and just how you solve those problems all the way to the future of where you guys think data quality is or should be and things that we can do. And Matthew, man, wow, true thought leader in the space of data. Really appreciate that. Michael,
Yeah.
great job of driving this conversation. This was great. Really appreciate you guys coming on, and thanks everyone for another Data Hurdles. I'm Chris Detzel, and
I'm Michael Burke. And don't forget to rate and subscribe.
yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Still
Thanks,
fine.
Matthew.
Thank you, Gilmer.
All right.
Take care, guys.